The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. When Jesus raised his eyes and saw that a large crowd was coming to him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him because he knew himself what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what good are these for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people recline." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place. So the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed them to those who were reclining, and also as much of the fish as they wanted. When they had had their fill, he said to his disciples, "Gather the fragments left over so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. When the people saw the sign he had done, they said, "This is truly the prophet, the one who is to come into the world." Since Jesus knew that they were going to come off and carry him off to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain alone. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, I'm going to date myself. And for those also who grew up in the 80s and 90s, you may remember this book, a popular illustrated book by the name of Where's Waldo? Do you remember that? What a book this was. It's a very simple concept if you're not familiar. It was a large book and you opened it up, and across the 2 pages of this book, your eyes were met with hundreds and hundreds of people. And the task was simple. Our friend Waldo was off on some world adventure, and in every scene documenting his travels, all you had to do was find where Waldo was. He was wearing some red and white hat and these round glasses. It was quite an overwhelming task, actually, because there were so many people, it was hard to find him. But you spent your time, and eventually, with patience, maybe a friend or you just gave up, you eventually found Waldo. Your task was complete. And yes, for those younger than I, this is what we used to do for fun. But an interesting thing happened after you found Waldo on these pages, because you could go back and look at the beautiful and intricate detail that the illustrator did to show all these people. Hundreds of them. I did some research. It took him weeks to make every single one of these pictures. And you would look at these people and you could see the detail in their faces. You could see the different activities they were doing. And after a while, kind of the whole thing about Waldo faded out, and you could have a journey with these people on this page in front of us. Hold that image for just one moment. Today is the 17th Sunday of Ordinary Time, and our gospel reading today is a familiar one. It appears in all 4 of the Gospels. this account from the 6th chapter of the Gospel of John. We find Jesus and his friends and some 5,000 people away from Galilee, which tells the reader back then that this is a place in which no food will be available. We know the story. 5,000 people, there's no food, the people are hungry. Jesus knows this. He takes a few loaves and fish, multiplies them so everyone has enough to eat. There is enough left over. Often the focus here, when we think and reflect on this beautiful passage, is Jesus himself. And though, of course, Jesus is important, I'd like us to take an adventure, like maybe we would, looking at the illustrated pictures of Where's Waldo. Because what we might be invited to do today is zoom into the faces, the activities of 3 other people that are mentioned in the gospel. And by looking at them, by thinking of them, we can learn more about Jesus himself. Remember, too, that Jesus, in this scene, if you were there, he would have had no halo. There was no cosmic spotlight shining down on Jesus at all times in his life. There was no angelic music surrounding him. This was a very ordinary scene of many, many people. But the 3 people I'd invite us to focus in on this morning are Philip, Andrew, and a young, unnamed boy. Philip. Jesus asks him, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" And Philip, we can picture, and it says in this text, was confused, overwhelmed, and did not know what to do. Jesus asked him a question, and he had no clue what to answer. He looked out and saw a simply impossible situation. Andrew, picture him. Andrew doesn't know either. He again is overwhelmed and confused and challenged by this impossible situation. 5,000 people. But we learned something interesting about Andrew by reading between the lines. We learned that he had been walking around, talking, and getting to know some of these people that were there on the side of this mountain. And it's there that he meets our 3rd important person, this young, unnamed boy. Because you see, Andrew remembers that he met a boy who had 5 loaves of barley and 2 fish. So he goes to this boy. I can imagine him with his family there, with this food that they had brought for themselves. And Andrew thinks, I saw this boy, I don't know what to do, but I'm going to bring him to Jesus. The boy doesn't say anything in this account. And how important is that? Because when the boy goes to Jesus to give him these 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he doesn't say to Jesus, "What are you doing?" He doesn't say, "This is impossible." We can picture him in our mind saying, "Well, here you go." What beautiful faith this boy had. Think about this. 2 people who knew Jesus so well, who were some of his best and closest friends, didn't know as much about Jesus as this young boy did, whose name is never mentioned. 3 people which can help us in our own lives, in our own journeys with Jesus. Philip and Andrew are confused and overwhelmed. How many of us in our lives find ourselves confused and overwhelmed? Don't raise your hands, it's not necessary. All our hands would go up. How many times does it seem Jesus is saying to us, "I need you to do this," and you look back at him and say, "How is that possible? I don't know how I can do this. But what do? What can we do? They took whatever they found. They didn't try to solve it. They went directly to Jesus. They took whatever they found and they said, we're going to let you deal with this, trusting with great faith that whatever we bring to Jesus, even though we think it is not enough, even when we are convinced it is impossible that this confusion and doubt will ever end, Jesus can transform it into new and creative things, as he did today in this gospel. By looking at these three people, we learn an important fact in the spiritual life. We always need to ask for help. If Andrew didn't ask the boy for help, nothing would have happened. An important part of the spiritual life, when we are lost and when we are confused, and we are glad they did this then, and it's important for us to do it now, to ask others for help. Because when we ask others for help, we trust that Jesus is there in that conversation, that we welcome Jesus into that conversation, and not knowing how, but we trust that Jesus can transform what we have and this question that we bring. And third, think of how much we can learn about faith from children. The faith that children have, the faith that this boy had when he said, well, there you go. There you go. These two great friends of Jesus asked a young boy for help. Have we ever considered, when in a challenging situation, to ask a child for advice? Now again, of course, there are many times that's not going to work out well. But there are times, there are moments. Maybe have we ever asked children for advice? Because if Andrew did not ask that young boy for help, this crowd probably would not have eaten anything. And finally, this morning, an invitation. In 5 minutes or so, we are going to see something that we are very familiar with at the offertory. At the back of the church, near the baptistry, a few people will come up. One person is going to come forward with bread. I invite you, for those 15 seconds from between the baptistry and the front of the altar here, to stop what you're doing. To stop what you're singing, the cantor can take care of it, and to focus and imagine yourself, not here in this church this July morning, but on the side of that mountain in Galilee, watching that young boy come forward with Philip and Andrew, bringing his bread to our Lord Jesus Christ. And we are the crowd. Today, in this cathedral, in our small corner of the universe here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, we will not see Jesus multiply this bread that is brought forward to feed 5,000 people. And I'm not in the business of comparing this and that, but if you ask me, it is just as much a miracle, if not more so, what we will witness today than what that crowd did. Because today, here, using the bread that is brought forward that you will watch, on this very altar here, Jesus will transform this bread and that wine into his own body and blood.